The Israeli government has one official narrative of what happened on October 7th. Of course, the slaughter of 1,400 innocent Israelis at the hands of Hamas. But now, startling new testimony is starting to emerge that may change what we understand about that day. This could trouble a lot of people. Dan Cohen is the founder of Uncaptured Media, a filmmaker, the documentary Killing Gaza, with some of these new startling revelations. Dan, welcome back to the show.
Hey, great to be with you, Clayton.
So, what testimony has started to emerge from Israelis that could shed new light on what happened that day?
Well, in the days after the events of October 7th, an interview with a survivor of the kiboutz Be'eri, the Israeli kiboutz Be'eri, where many people died, gave an interview in Israeli media. And she said, she was very clear that, and repeated in her interview, that Israeli hostages were killed by Israeli gunfire, perhaps in a firefight between the Hamas fighters and Israeli military, but that it was Israeli military bullets that actually killed them.
בגינה של האנשים מהקיבוץ שיש 5 בני ערובה ששוכבים או 6 על האדמה בחוץ, ממש כצאן לטבח מול הירי של הימ"מ שלנו והמחבלים.
הטרוריסטים ירו בהם?
לא, הם נהרגו מהחילופי ירי, תבין שהיה חילופי ירי מאוד מאוד קשים.
זאת אומרת, יכול להיות שזה כוחותינו ירו בהם? כשניסו לחסל את החוטפים, את החמאס?
כן, חיסלו את כולם, כולל הבני ערובה, כי היה שם חילופי ירי מאוד מאוד קשים. אני משוחררת בסביבות השעה 5:30, ב8:30 כנראה מסתיימת הלחימה, אחרי שהיה חילופי אש מטורפים, אפילו 2 פקזים של טנק שירו לתוך הבית, שזה בית קיבוצי קטן, זה לא איזה, רואים את זה בחדשות.
כן.
זה לא מקום גדול. וברגע הזה כולם נהרגו, היה שקט חוץ מניצולה אחת שיצאה, הדס דגן, וזהו, וגם.
איך כולם נהרגו?
מהחילופי אש.
מהחילופי אש, כלומר יכול להיות שגם זה מאש כוחותינו?
חד משמעית.
כן?
וככה אני מאמינה.
אוי, זה נשמע כל כך רע.
כן, וכולם מתו.
So that interview was actually censored by the Israeli government in order to prevent it from getting to the Israeli public, which had basically been through this shock and awe propaganda campaign to convince them that everything that just happened on October 7th was purely a Hamas terrorist attack, that Hamas is worse than ISIS, and so there can be no negotiation, and the only answer is to obliterate Gaza, and whatever happened in those horrible scenes on that horrible day of October 7th is purely the fault of Hamas and has nothing to do with Israeli military tactics or strategy, or decisions that were made either on the fly that day. Now, there has been another article that came out in the Israeli liberal magazine Haaretz, in which it cites an Israeli military figure who was there. There was one who was in a bunker near Gaza, who was trying to call in airstrikes on this kibbutz, of course, which would have killed everybody. That did not happen. However, what did happen is another Israeli commander who was on the scene actually ordered his men, his soldiers, to open fire on everyone in these houses. So the Hamas militants were inside these houses with Israeli hostages, under the belief, apparently, that because they have hostages, they'd be able to get back into Gaza, as others had. But the Israeli military, this commander, and we don't know how high up this decision-making goes, decided, no, we're going to kill everyone in here, including with use of tank shells. This is according to this Haaretz article. So, I mean, what actually happened, clearly, is the Israeli military said, we are not going to negotiate with Hamas at all, and we're going to kill everyone here, including our own people. Now, this has been pretty much hidden from the Israeli public as best as possible, with the censorship of that interview. Yasmin Porat is the survivor's name. and with but now that has been published in Haaretz. So I mean, it raises way more questions about what actually happened, not only in Be'eri but in other places too, where many Israelis were killed. And that's not to say that Hamas did not kill people. Definitely that happened. But Israel apparently clearly killed its own people in order to avoid negotiations.
So a couple of questions here, right? Because immediately people would say, well, obviously, all right, well, come on, Dan, this has got to be friendly fire, right? That it was probably friendly fire. And in the scuffle of the moment, the Israeli military dealing with Hamas terrorists, which just invaded and were carrying out this brutal attack, that yes, clearly there was going to be people killed accidentally, that it would have been friendly fire. How do they address that piece of it?
Well, according to this Haaretz article, and I'll just read exactly what he says. This is according to Nir Hasson, the Israeli journalist. He says, and he's quoting a resident of the Be'eri who survived. He says, after commanders in the field made difficult decisions, including shelling houses with all their occupants inside in order to eliminate the terrorists along with the hostages, did the IDF complete the takeover of the kiboutz. The price was terrible. At least 112 Be'eri people were killed. So there's also another part of this article there's another one on October 11th that that quotes a guy named Erez, a deputy commander, and he says they fought inside the kibbutz from house to house with the tanks. We had no choice. So they're actually firing tank shells. It's not as if there was, I mean, there was clearly close combat, and maybe some of them were killed by friendly fire, in combat, in gun battles between Hamas and the Israeli forces. And that seems to be what Yasmin Porat, the first one to come out and give her testimony, was describing. However,
so she came out and said that it was friendly fire. That's what she was describing.
She was saying that yes, that Israelis were killed by Israeli gunfire, not that the Israeli military decided pure only to kill their own people, but so basically at first what we learned from her testimony is that best case scenario is that it was friendly fire, between in a clash between the two sides. But later, with the publication of these other articles, what became clear is the Israeli military made a decision in the field to kill everyone there using tank shells and just opening fire on the houses where Hamas was holding these hostages. We have to look at this in context of something called the Hannibal Directive, which is an Israeli military procedure to kill any Israeli soldier taken captive by enemy forces. So in 2014, this was implemented in the 51-day war on Gaza in the southern city of Rafah, where Hamas had managed to take captive an Israeli soldier named Hadar Golden. And when that happened, the Israeli military used the full might of its force and bombed this area massively, killing Hadar Golden, their own soldier, as well as well over 100 Palestinians at the same time. This became known as Black Friday among Palestinians. So this is the Hannibal Directive, and I think what we saw in Be'eri, where this occurred on October 7th, is the very same logic as what happened in 2014, the Hannibal Directive, that we are not going to allow any Israelis to be taken captive, taken hostage, so we're just going to kill them all. So then there can be no negotiations. And then look at what's happening inside the Gaza Strip, where hundreds of Israelis are held hostage and captive by Hamas, and Israel is doing nothing, at least publicly, to secure the release. There's no negotiations that anyone knows about, and is instead bombing the entire place to smithereens, turning it into a big pile of rubble and killing were well over 5,000 Palestinians dead, including 400 overnight. And according to Hamas, dozens of Israeli hostages have been killed in the bombing too, which makes perfect sense. So, I mean, is the Hannibal Directive, this policy of Israel killing its own people to prevent negotiations, is this being applied throughout the Gaza Strip?
Israeli sources have told me that they thought it was a great mistake for them not to have done more to try to get those initial 200 or so hostages back immediately within the first 24 to 48 hours. And now, in many ways, they become a significant liability. And what I'm hearing from different Israeli sources is these hostages will likely not be living for very much longer, especially as this ground assault unfolds. Does that comport with what you're hearing from your sources as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the families of the hostages are absolutely desperate. They're demonstrating outside of Hakiria, the Israeli Defense Ministry in Tel Aviv. And in fact, there is a video that went around of people attacking the families and calling them traitors and saying they hope those hostages die. So there's an element of Israeli society that fully agrees with this logic that, no matter what, the state is above, is more important than the people. So, I mean, no negotiations, just kill everyone. That is basically the Israeli government's policy. And had even in Be'eri, or when those hostages were taken into Gaza, had it said, hold on, let's pause. We know we can negotiate with Hamas, as we have done many, many times before, through intermediaries, through Egypt, through Qatar, then they could have worked something out. But instead, the Israeli government is intent on destroying Gaza and obliterating as many people as possible, including its own citizens.
Do you think, we heard over the weekend, of course, Secretary of State Antony Blinken saying no negotiations, no ceasefire. The United States isn't interested in a ceasefire agreement, but you have, of course, President of Turkey coming out, Erdogan, saying that he would be happy to mediate a peacefire agreement, a negotiation perhaps between Hamas and, Palestinians, and, of course, Israel. And that may actually help release some of these hostages. Do you think that there's an appetite for any mediation by Erdogan and the Turks?
Definitely. I mean, we see these massive demonstrations in all over the world, but in Turkey, there's obviously a lot of sympathy for Palestinians, and seeing what Israel is doing to Gaza. There's no doubt that the people want a ceasefire and negotiations, and so Erdogan is well positioned to do that. I mean, Turkey is influential in Gaza, and of course has strong contacts with Israel. So, I mean, Erdogan could do it, Qatar could do it, Egypt could do it, the U.S., in some capacity could do it.
Right.
Yeah, but you need two partners to be willing to negotiate. And I mean, Hamas actually released a few hostages the other day, American Israeli hostages, and turned them over to the Israeli military in exchange for that small amount of aid that came in. And has said, Hamas alleged that they offered to release two Israelis and gave their names and ID numbers for humanitarian reasons, for nothing in exchange, not demanding anything. And they say the Israeli government denied it, refused it, rejected it. The Israeli government has said that this is a lie, that it's propaganda. But I mean, considering Israel is bombing everything in sight, and you can be sure that is killing its own hostages inside Gaza, as it did in Be'eri, in the kiboutz on October 7th. Well, it's not very credible in terms of how it's trying to do anything to secure the release of those hostages. And of course, for Hamas, it doesn't, having dead Israeli hostages, killing them doesn't really do any good. Hamas did say early on, after October 7th, that if the bombing without warning of residential homes didn't stop, then it would begin executing the hostages one by one on camera. Well, the bombing of the bombing without warning never stopped, and Hamas never actually did what it said it would do. So, I mean, that really says a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, it says a lot right there. The only reason Hamas wants those captives is to be able to negotiate. And I think what they figured is, well, I mean, we got 200 hostages. Israel has to negotiate. And Israel basically, said,
Doesn't seem to be,
called their ante and said, no, we're not going to negotiate. We're going to kill all of you, including our own people. So you want to see crazy? I'll show you crazy is basically Israel's position.
Yeah. You thought these were going to be bargaining chips, these 200 hostages? Well, we've just leveled half of northern Gaza. So it doesn't seem that they are much of a bargaining chip at this stage, unfortunately. Unbelievable. Just real quick, we'll get you out of here on this. When the censorship started this initial interview with this Israeli woman, where was that initial interview? Who did the initial interview, and how was it suppressed? How was it suddenly blocked in Israel?
The Israeli military holds there's an Israeli state censor. So, for even a foreign journalist or Israeli journalist, you have to abide by that, or else you can, as an Israeli citizen, you can be held liable legally for breaking the censor. And so if they order that, then, Israeli journalists must legally comply. The foreign press, the New York Times or anyone else doesn't have to abide by that because they don't have any way to enforce it. But the Western media typically goes along with it. If there's like a gag order from the Israeli state censor, then, all of the Western media does it. And so this was, I'd have to look and see exactly what channel in Israel it was published on. But after it was censored, it was published by the Electronic Intifada. So that's who actually, broke this story out of,
the
Israeli.
censorship.
Yeah, exactly. The censorship.
Interesting. Dan Cohen, thank you so much from Uncaptured Media. Appreciate it. You can follow him on Twitter. What is your Twitter handle?
At Dan Cohen 3000, and I'm on Twitter all the time, and we're doing a lot at Uncaptured Media. So it's Uncaptured News on Twitter, and you can check us out on YouTube and Rumble.
Absolutely. Dan's not getting a lot of sleep these days, I can tell you that. Nonstop working on this. Dan,
Lots
great
of
to see you.
coffee.
Yeah, lots of coffee, lots of great coverage. Thank you so much for this story, Dan. This is a story that people have not heard because it's being censored. So thank you for this. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Clayton.
Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.